Thanks everyone who participated. I followed along myself. Here's my version of the homework. 2 Discords, twice the fun. Hell yeah. Nah, I mean, you know what? I love Discord. How about we double love Discord? I felt like I was having such an easy time with this one. And yet, when I looked back on it, I was like, studies are always tricky because sometimes you feel like you're screwing it up hard, and then you take a look at it a day later and realize that actually you learned a lot and you had a great time and it was excellent. And then other times, you just feel like you're knocking it out of the park and you are cakewalking through it. And then you like look back at it and you go, it's a miss. It's a solid miss. And it's so hard to self-assess on these things, which is why we are today going to be going into over some of yours, and then we are going to give some critiques. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some suggestions on process. I'm going to highlight some of the things I think you guys are doing good. And if anybody wants to talk on stage with me about their work, feel free to raise your hand. And I can pull you on stage and we can chit-chat about what you're up to. Yeah, if you're not a Photoshop user, my recommendation is Krita. There are things I wish were different about Krita, but as far as free tools go, it is incredibly powerful. For all of you people who are just getting into digital art for the first time, don't feel like you need to go ahead and give Adobe a ton of money. Just go ahead and download Krita for free. Krita. It's easy. Wow, I really like this one from Lele. I'm just looking through this for the first time. Hey, Summer Dragon is. So glad that you got to participate. I know sometimes it's difficult for you. This came out really nice. And it's great to see it done traditionally. Wow, we got a great number of submissions. Really fantastic to see it. Oh, and Delia posted the work in progress video. I actually did the same. I've got a video, and I don't know what to do with it yet. I did a video recording of myself doing mine. Delia, how do you feel about the way that your work came out this week? I know you've been pretty consistent with doing some studies recently.
It was fine. I mean, I could only really put in an hour. I'd like to make another character though from imagination. But I've been finding a lot lately with my portraits. Even if it's like I'm only spending an hour, but I tend to make the face bigger than it needs to. You can see it in the video too. Like I keep shrinking it. I'm like, ah, shit's too big. Ah, shit's too big. So I'm trying to not hyper focus on the face so much. And again, it's just an hour, nothing crazy.
I noticed that the way you blocked it in was by starting off with like the big peach colored circle here. I thought this was interesting. Like I couldn't imagine trying to nail the proportions correctly from this kind of start. In part because when you start with like blocks of color like this, it's like the way you're doing it is it's not just like you're not just trying to replicate the reference exactly. Let me pull up the reference next to it. Because you're not looking at it just as like a random assortment of colored shapes, right? Like you are giving credence to the fact that there is like a whole head under here, under this mop of hair. Yeah. And you are giving it a shape that is relatively head-shaped. And so, like, you're not getting to benefit from looking at this as an abstract and starting to block in loose bits just as abstract shapes. And like, I think that's the expectations of where you think it's going to go leaking in this early are the thing that's causing you to, like, lose sight of the proportions so immediately.
Okay, yeah.
When it comes to those first few blockout steps, I try to turn off my brain as to what I'm seeing exactly and try to focus on this as though it is just a collection of shapes. If there's anything I am trying to pick up on, it's sort of these lines of motion. So it's not just there's a head above the shoulders. When you think about it that way, you end up with something that's very symmetrical because we know that the figure is symmetrical. But in reality, what we have is the rectangle of the body is actually leaning from left to right. And if you can see the slight tilt of the shoulders, and then you see the head is tilted right to left and pushing over this way more. Knocking in a few construction lines to figure out like what are the size of the abstract shapes that are making up the form, and then also like sort of where are the ley lines of the pose coming together. That's going to be a little bit more informative, so that when you get to the point where you're like, okay, I recognize this as a person. They have a chin, they have eyes, nose, and a mouth. That like you have this abstract like structure, something that is more, like a framework, like a lattice, like scaffolding that is that you can build on, that will provide you some place to put all of these features. Because trying to place the features abstractly inside these like loose bits that you are already kind of estimating that they're a person, it's really tough, and it leads to a lot of misestimations that miss over and over again.
Yeah.
And then you end up like further away from the reference than you ultimately want. It's frustrating. It can be a little bit of a time waster having to move things around after you kind of found where they are. But yeah. I think it came together nicely, especially for only working on it for an hour.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to take a quick browse through the remainder of these. Ooh, really nice. And then see if anybody also pitched in and did the bonus exercise of trying to do something for imagination as well. Miguel produced a really excellent one here. What is going? The appearance of the jacket almost looks photographic in parts. I'm going to open this in the browser, get a closer look. Huh. Wow. Even with that really soft brush, it comes off really crisp once you get further away from it. It's an interesting effect. This is really interesting. The difference in like edge quality between, it looks like it might be a lasso tool edge, or maybe not, because I'm seeing the little divot in here that's nice and round. Wow, it's cool to see the full resolution up close. It's a very different brush it's a very different set of brushes than what I typically use. For mine, I use mostly like a round brush, but you can see how mixing up the brushwork allows for like very different types of we're getting these softer, more pillowy shapes in some of the clothing folds here through using like a softer edge brush. While the the more textured stuff is mocking up a bit of texture that reads excellently at a distance, even though it doesn't look like much up close. This is a study. And so this is the sort of thing that if you were to get early on into a painting, you could get the impression of the thing and then go back in later. And if you're going to spend a little bit more time on it and clean this up, it's really good. Personally, I never really liked these kinds of fuzzy edged brushes for hair. This is a place where I think there's probably some room for improvement. With really organic shapes like hair, let me pull this into Photoshop really quick. I tend to want to work, I don't know why my Photoshop canvas is this size. We're just going to deal with it. I tend to want to use something with a little bit of a stiffer edge. Even though hair has like tends to terminate in kind of a soft way. We get like these little flyaways, we get these little soft bits. It tends to be pretty soft towards the edge. A lot of the clumps of hair tend to be pretty sturdy. So you tend to be able to like construct the larger shapes inside the hair using something that's got a pretty firm edge on it. That'll give you a little bit more of a solid look through the hair. It tends to be, this is where these kinds of flowing organic shapes are where the round brush I think really does the best work. I'm just using my my basic round brush here. It's got the pressure sensitivity on it. And it'll create, when you run the length up and down like a hair strand, a hair chunk, it'll create like a nice crisp edge along the end of it, while also like rendering up and down the length of it. Because the way it ends in these nice soft marks here, so as you are running along the length of the strand, you can see how it smooths running along this way. There's a bit of a gradient that smooths along this way, while the edges tend to be pretty solid. The round brush can be used for literally everything, but there are places where it's stronger and weaker. And I think that these kinds of flowing organic shapes are one of the places where it's strongest. Because as you like find areas where it needs to like fall off and be lighter or darker, you can curve it by just sampling a little bit of a color and just brushing it in like this, up and down the length of the strand. And you can, you know, bring up the highlight on it. You can make something that's a much tighter highlight like this. And then if you want to, you bring down the opacity. I'm just using the number keys to adjust my opacity. And you can move like longer ways up and down to be able to get these like bigger chunks. And that'll give you a more structured look rather than the kind of random, it's like more blurry and loose. When everything is like a mix of light and dark kind of randomly, it comes off, I think, a little bit more flat. We get something that feels a little bit more three-dimensional by building it up like this. And then once you have these more firm strands in place, you can go in and shrink the brush down and start to create some little flyaways that overlap and break up the shapes. Do that as like a pass over the top. So you can have individual, you can even go as small as creating like highlights for individual hairs. Because even though we think about hair as being like this ending in these like fuzzy tips, like this, and so like a brush that has this like scrapey look to it where all these lines kind of run in parallel, we think of the structure of hair as being like that. But I don't think that the appearance of it ultimately is like that. We end up with these like larger, thicker strands that tend to terminate less like, you know, fuzzy, like parallel lines and more like in terms of like solid curving strands like this, solid ones that taper down to a point like the way that a paintbrush does. And then the individual hairs kind of come out all over randomly. And so you end up, you can just mock those in really quick by just shrinking the brush down and then throwing a few lighter colored strands or maybe a few darker colored strands in to create flyaways. And those flyaways end up creating that, the sense of like lots of smaller individual hairs building up, you know, going all kinds of different directions. They tend to be more random than running parallel like this. So when you layer those two, when you build up the hair in these larger chunks first, and then you start putting the smaller bits on top of it like that, I think that's what that ultimately looks the best. And I think it's actually pretty fast to do once you get the hang of it. When it comes to places where the hair is ending, I tend to keep the ending of it pretty soft. On my own, I ended up letting it get having it start off, let me see if I can find the layer. Starting off as more of a big solid shape, like this. And then as I'm building up these individual strands, you know, finding places where they terminate and creating these little windows that go in between them. Because I want the sense that it is soft at the edges, so I'm leaving a little bit of blurriness here just to stylize that a little bit, give the impression of that, the way in which it ends in a blurry way. The way I'm building up the hair from beginning to end on these kinds of studies is typically by first starting off with a solid chunk like this, and then working it up so that it's got more of a blurry edge to it, because we're not really we're going to be seeing all the way that all of these overlapping strands, they tend to like, as they get further away from the head, they form a mass that like diminishes in opacity as they get further away. And this is just like roughly mocking it up and then finding areas to cut it out and build up more specific individual pieces later on. It's better to kind of break down the different bits of what you're seeing rather than to separate out each element as its own perfect, specific little, impression. Like instead of trying to draw a whole mass of all of the hair, understanding the various different components that make up the hair, like, the large 3D shape of it. You can see I've got highlights at the top, shadows at the bottom. The whole thing is being seen as like one giant helmet-like mass at first and building the shape of that, then subdividing that shape so that it gains smaller individual pieces, and then from there building the texture of that on top of that shape to be able to give it its like final bit of finish and polish. So this is true generally whenever you're painting, is that you're never going to be able to look at a reference and be able to perfectly copy every single element in the whole thing all at once. You're not going to go, I see, there is segment number, 27B, and this little piece right here should be exactly this color here. Like this is how computers understand images in this very precise machine-like way. But what we're seeing inside the reference is a number of different bits of things. There's like the largest structure of the overall body, which is like, as I was talking about with Delia, this sense of like, how wide are the shoulders coming out? And like, where's the center point and what angle is it leaning at? We're thinking, we don't need to literally mock up these. When you see construction lines like this in a painting, it's typically not being used as like a firm grid that somebody is drawing out and building on top of. What this represents more than anything else is an illustration of what's happening in the artist's mind as they're working. So we're not literally going to need to draw out a cylinder to describe the arm and draw out guidelines to show where all of the individual, where like how the cylinder is laid out as a piece of geometry covered in lines. We're not going to need to literally knock in the exact location of how the shoulders are, the width of the shoulders and how they're sloped. Trying to create this complete lattice of instructional lines is not ultimately that helpful. But we see it in instructional material because in your mind, as you are considering the reference, you should be thinking about those aspects of it. You should be thinking about, okay, well, what are the big shapes and how are they laid out on the page? So how that translates into the next step can go a lot of different ways. Like Delia was demonstrating doing these very large blocks of color. Personally, I like creating a really loose sketch. Like I saw a lot of you building up like a line drawing. For a study, I like to do a loose line drawing first just to get a sense of the structure. And you can see me at times trying to like literally figure out, where these bits are. But it's there only insofar as it's useful to get me to the next step. It's there just to help me create a sense of context for what's going to be coming next. As I was working on this, I was thinking a lot about this idea. It's really impossible to look at a reference and from there instantly know where every inch, like every spot of color and every bit of value is going to appear on your canvas. What you need instead is a sense of context, because we're starting off with a blank page and we really just don't know where everything is going to end up. To me, I always feel like I'm looking at the canvas through a pair of binoculars, and I'm only ever seeing a spot about this big overall. I can sort of lean back and maybe look at my cone of vision will be a little wider, but my cone of vision, my area of attention, I've noticed, tends to be fairly small. And so as it like kind of moves around this thing, as it moves around the canvas, it's only seeing a small bit of context at a time. Like, where are these lines meeting up? And, what angle is this elbow coming out at? And so to try to push everything together in a way where it's all like working, it's all correct to the reference, while only being able to really have attention for one little bit at a time, I need to be able to get a better sense of where the whole thing is going overall. And so the thing I'm trying to do as early as possible is create a version of the image that's as rough and as complete as it can be. So this is why I like to start with black and white. This is why I like to start with value, is because I can get a much clearer sense on how does my incomplete version of the image relate back to the reference? Because if I'm only going to see a tiny little corner of it at a time, I am going to need to like understand how that corner matches up with the things that are around it. And like once I have a block in of the large values and the large shapes, and I can confidently lean on those, I can move on to the next steps with some amount of confidence. All right. Rather than go on the same point, I'm going to pull open. I'm going to take a look at some more. Thanks, Miguel. This was a really good one. All right. Is there anybody here who wants to raise their hand, who wants to come on stage and talk about their study? Hi there. How's it going?
Mine's the one's a bit different. It's going good. I'm sorry. I get nervous when I'm on speaker, so I'm sorry if I stutter or anything.
No problem at all. It's normal to be nervous doing public speaking. So what was your experience with the study like?
I enjoyed it, but I'm terrible with skin tones. I tried to make it kind of different, because from what I understand, like kind of the extra assignment was to kind of make it your own a bit. So I added, subtracted, and kind of tried to put a different lighting a little bit there. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I just feel like, not outside of just my brushwork, it's kind of messy, I feel, and the shapes kind of the jacket especially are kind of wonky. Mm-hmm. I feel like the skin looks dead. And it's like, I'm just I could give a lot of critiques to myself, but I just don't know how necessarily to fix it.
Let's talk about skin tone. This is something that came up last week also. I personally don't think you need to worry about, like, there's not an exact skin tone that is going to be right for anything. Like, all things in all scenes are going to be pretty relative. So it's not so important that you nail the exact correct skin tone for this reference. What's more important is looking at things like the relative temperature and saturation. So like you might notice on this reference, if we, let's blur it a little bit to get away from like the specifics quite so much, you can see how dark and saturated it gets around the eyes. The way that this person is like leaning forwards and has these like really dark shadows over their eyes, we're getting a much darker and more saturated skin tone. It's going a lot more red in and around the eyes. We can see that the cheeks also contain a little bit more redness in them than like the chin and the forehead. You can see that there's like that natural bit of blush coming through. And it's sometimes not always easy to spot when you're getting caught up in like individual pixels or like looking at edges, or there's a lot of different visual elements that can catch our eye. So the important thing is that we try to visually filter out all of the things that are catching our attention and focus exclusively on one aspect of the image. And in this moment, the one aspect we're looking at is like color temperature. Where is it going to be warmer and saturated, and where is it going to be like cooler? And so in this case, we're getting those cooler colors like through the highlights. And then we're getting the warmer colors like through the cheeks and around the eyes and in the shadows. So like if you've got some really great warm colors that have seeped in like here, this little color I'm pulling out of the hair strand, would be great to mix down through all the areas where it's starting to get, where the shadows are being picked up. And like, you've got the glasses kind of covering the eyes here, but even still getting some shadow from them using this like saturated shadow color you have is going to do a lot in terms of adding some life back into the face. And so I'm not going to be doing anything fancy. I'm just trying to find colors that are already in your canvas and push them around a little bit. Same thing like with this orange here. Another beautiful color that you've either already color picked or has emerged through your process. I think that picking saturated colors that are already somewhere else in your canvas and then trying to sort of glaze them over the places in the skin tone where it feels a little dead is often a thing that will work. So if you're feeling like you've got a little bit too much gray in the skin, taking some of these colors that are already on your palette and pulling them in is going to make a big difference to adding a certain amount of life to it. In this reference, we don't really have, like you have this strong reflection of like a white or gray coming off of this side. I don't feel like we're really seeing that here. And because as a study, even if you're going to make it your own, I think one of the important things is that we recognize what's in the study and why it's looking the way that it is. You have recognized that there is a little bit of a highlight coming across, reflected across the side of the neck here. I noticed this as well. You can see it's brighter here than it is as it gets towards the middle. But
yes, sir.
The shape, the way that the shape of the neck is formed is quite a bit different than like these muscles that you've mocked in here. This is, I think, like you working from your imagination and building off of the language you already have for like the anatomy of the neck. And the advantage of doing these kinds of studies is that you start to do something like this, and then you look over at the reference and you catch yourself and you go, oh shoot, that's actually not what it should look like. And finding those differences is like an opportunity to start to like add to your visual language. I'm sorry, what was
No, I totally get it. And I was looking at that at the neck and I kept on having issues with that. And I was like, how do I get, because I can see that small muscle on the right side kind of poking through a little bit, kind of highlighted. But I was like, how do I integrate that without it kind of coming out so much? And I kept on having a hard time trying to make sure that it was noticed, but not there at the same time. And
I think one of the things that's likely that you're also missing on your, shoot, I should have been working on a separate layer. There is, if we look carefully, there's a little bit of a half step up where the lighting on this part of the face is a bit brighter than underneath on the neck. That because this figure is leaning forwards a little bit, part of the reason we can tell that they're leaning forwards towards us is because the neck isn't catching so much of the highlight, because it's all of the planes of the neck are facing downwards. You know, one of the things that you've changed about this is you've changed the posture of the figure to lean backwards, standing up straighter with their head above the shoulders. And that is coming forwards not only in the position, the sort of XY position on the axis of the canvas here, but like this Z position, this like leaning of forwards. It's not something that comes through very clearly in the structure here, but it's coming through in the lighting. And so I think that if you can observe the fact that like the neck is coming in a little darker here, and using your own color palette, try to make sure that it's doing the same thing. And then we can if we want to have like a, let's see, bring in a highlight color here, and then find where the brightest part of this whole face feels like it's like right along the chin line here, right?
Yes, sir.
And so really just letting the reference guide us on where this is happening, I think is, this is the thing that always, the back and forth I always have with these is I have all these presumptions on where I think the highlights are going to be. I think the highlight should typically be like, oh, up here on the cheek, and in this case, it's not. And so now I have to ask myself like, okay, why? What am I actually seeing here that's defying my expectations? And the process of analyzing that and then, very intentionally reproducing it on my own copy reinforces that observation and builds on my overall knowledge of this subject. And it doesn't do it always in like a kind of academic, conscious way, but it's one of those things where like next time you go to paint a face, it just feels easier to get it to feel right. And it's not a matter of it being you like knowing why it's better. You just know where to put the color to make it feel right. And so all the assumptions that you're bringing into this that are currently acting as mistakes, as you defy those expectations and, build on like create a study that moves past them, the next time you go to paint a face, you are going to then have additional ammunition on how you're going to like make it feel just right.
Sure.
On the eyes here, you've added these like glossy reflections. This figure has no glossy reflections. It's kind of uncanny actually, with the gray eyes, with the tiny pupils, and then like no reflection in the eyes. It's a very intense look. Right? And I think it's one of the key features of this piece. So I want to try to make sure that we get that.
I think I added it just because I've normally, every time I have seen other artwork, I've always been like, oh, highlight.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just added it naturally, like without even thinking about it. So now you bring it up, I'm like, oh, that's kind of that should have been a no-brainer.
Yeah, but I mean that it's like the reason why this is educational to do is not because you're going to look at it and make every choice correct. The reason why it's educational is because you're going to make a bunch of incorrect choices. And the more of them you can observe as you're doing this, the more you're going to get this feeling of like somebody's standing behind you, pelting you in the back of the head with rocks while you're trying to paint. You're like, oh, fuck, stop. Like, this hurts. I don't like noticing all these mistakes. It feels bad. But like that bad feeling is actually your brain giving feedback signals to itself, being like, do that different next time. Pay closer attention next time. And it adds up to you like having this expanded knowledge on how to paint faces, how to create realistic lighting. Like all of those, if you can stay aware of where you're doing things wrong versus right and just allow those signals to connect, you are going to consistently get better every time you do one of these repetitions. So it's really important to not just like getting it right is not the goal. Noticing when you're getting it wrong is the goal. Because this is not a painting we're going to be selling. It's not something we're going to be adding to the portfolio. It's a study. And like the purpose of this study is to expand our awareness on painting.
Yes, sir. Well, I thank you guys so much for your time and for helping me out here.
And thank you for coming on stage. I appreciate your bravery here.
Thank you again. Bye, sir.
All right, very cool. Anybody else has a study and they want to talk about it and get a crit, feel free to raise your hand. I am available. Otherwise, I'm going to pick one and get into it a little bit. I want to see if there's anything in any of these that jumps out to me in a way that I think is going to be useful to demo. When somebody has a really striking appearance like this, it can be very difficult to get them to feel natural. They'll This stare is like is crazy intense. Doing it in pencil. I have really liked, I've worked in pencil for basically my whole career as a way to start things off. And I'm convinced that like the current generation is missing out a little bit by not always starting their drawings off in pencil. Starting everything off digitally can be, I think, a little bit of a handicap. And it feels like it's more powerful, but the fidelity of it is a lot lower. Oh wow, Tristan's is has imagined like a much more complete version of the character here. Both Pukao and Errorist have done some really interesting stuff with this study by first doing a fairly faithful, I would say very faithful, version of the study, and then going back in and doing a imaginative character that has like some similar characteristics. This back and forth of doing a study, absorbing all the visual information, hitting all those bumps in the road, and like just letting your brain soak in all the visual information on folds, on anatomy, on like the way the character looks and feels, and then going in and doing imaginative work afterwards. It's like your brain has been fed like fertilizer, and it grows and expands in real time. This process of constantly like analyzing reference and then going and making something from imagination, you won't ever consciously notice the ways in which your imaginative work is being fed by the reference, but it will constantly be growing. And so this is why I suggested this. And it does take a little bit more time, though. I want to make sure that these lessons don't require too much time each week. We've only got an hour each week to. Oh, I see. Tristan actually did this assignment both ways as well, with the direct study and then with the more imaginative version. That's great to see. If anybody was struggling with the basics of how to do this study, feel free to raise your hand. I'd be happy to do a little quick demo to try to get you over any hiccups. What we're going to be doing next week for next week's assignment is I want to do another photo study, but I want to do it's really interesting to see the difference between Errorist's two different versions here, because what we're seeing is two like extremely different approaches to it. One of them is primarily a drawing with simple flat colors, while the other one is being done with like blotches of paint. I personally have always had an easier time with painting than with drawing, but for many people, it's the reverse. Would you quickly be able to explain how you have the base shades of gray on hand that you start with? Aha. I was using one shade of gray and just scaling the opacity around, but it didn't seem right. That's an excellent question. The answer is that I'm using black. And the black is coming in at different opacities. So I'm starting off with a simple gray background. I'm doing the lines over the top. And then from the lines, I've got solid black with the opacity turned down. And depending on the opacity, I'll end up with different shades of gray. So I can do, I can go in, if I go in with like 60% or 80% gray, I can block in an area to be fairly dark. Or if I do it at 40%, even with the exact same color, even with solid black, I can get it in something that's a lot lighter. And then from there, you can color select it to be able to grab the color that you're looking for. So like if I have a white over the top of this, now even in this very simple scene with just a few brush strokes, now we have a variety of different versions of gray to pick from. So if I sample this and I start to paint it over the top, we can start to mix these two grays together to get something that falls in between them. And then if we want to lighten it back up, we can grab one of these lighter grays and start to lighten it back this way. See how that works? Feels like using black and white charcoal. Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit like black and white charcoal. I would say that the most similar I've felt to painting digitally is probably acrylic paint. But you would never do it this way if you were working in acrylic, where you started with a pure black paint and then you just thinned it out like crazy. But oftentimes if you're working, transparently in oils where you've just got a ton of medium and you're just sort of slopping it around to like, build not with black, but with like a dark brown or something that is like a sepia color, you can start to build up a loose sense of value without having to actually mix any paint out of the tube. That's really what we're doing at these very earliest steps. And then once you have a variety of gray tones like on your canvas, that's when you can start to select stuff and blend it around and get a variety of a greater variety of like different gray tones. The same ends up applying to color as well once you start getting into color. I found that like off the bat, my main goal is to try to make sure that everything I'm going to be working with is happening on the canvas. And then from there, it ends up being a matter of like trying to push everything so that it's in the right place. Tristan's asking, do you have a specific way of building rhythm in your artwork? It's something I try to pay attention to in my study. Well, let me take a look at your study really quick. I see. You've done a very interesting thing here where you're doing it all with solids. Doing everything with solids is going to be an assignment that I think I'm going to be giving out one of these weeks because it's a art challenge that I personally haven't engaged with too much, but I've been thinking a lot about. This is a very common beginner art challenge. Hey, Tristan, how's it going?
Hi. Sorry, I have an awful cold, so I might sound a little...
It's okay.
I ran into a problem doing my art where every piece was taking like a huge amount of time, and it kind of killed my enjoyment a bit. So I've been trying to become a bit more efficient at conveying the most important things. So yeah, that's why I did kind of everything in solids except for the face, where it became a bit too harsh.
Mm-hmm.
But I tried to kind of build a good rhythm in the art by starting off with a line art and then going from there. Just wondering if that's something you keep in mind when you make a piece or when you do a study.
It's interesting to me that you talk about like you having to like go to flats because otherwise it's too slow and you're getting frustrated. Because for me, the number one thing that's slow and frustrating is making line art. And I know for some people, like making line art is like their favorite part of the whole experience. And for me, it's like
it kind of is boring. Like that for me. I have the line art here, I think, if you want to maybe compare it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is very useful. So you get a big charge out of doing the line art? Do you enjoy it?
Yeah, and I'm also the fastest at it, I think, out of all the steps of the drawing. Oh, that is the part that I'm the fastest at, I think.
Oh, the fastest? But what about your feelings of enjoyment? Do you like the line art step?
I like the line art step a lot, and a lot of the finished part is just the line art that I kind of made a different color to make it fit in with the colors I put underneath.
Color hold?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the thing about art style is like some of it comes from like our hand and our brain, and some of it just comes from our preference on like what steps in the process we actually really like and want to spend the most time on. If you really love the line art process, part of the process, I think that you could be really well served by just spending more time with it, because the line art as it is right now is good, but you've got this excellent like thick and thin line going through the jacket, but I can tell that there's areas that could be a little bit more delicate. Some of these lines I know are much lower contrast inside the reference and could probably be thinned out a lot. And some of them might even be able to get lost. Like you have this really stiff outlining on all of the threads, all of the stitching. Like I think that finding a more simplified version of this might create an even more elegant look. And then if you're spending, 30 minutes on the line art and 30 minutes on the colors, I'd be curious to see what it looks like if you spent 45 minutes on the line art and 15 minutes on the colors. Because to me, like whenever I'm mentoring somebody, I always want to try to focus on the things that they get the most out of artistically. And for everybody, that's a little bit different. The process I have for painting reflects my interest in the steps of painting that I get the most out of. And so it's not a matter of me having like a really good sense on like what's the most important visual information. I only know what parts about painting I like more than others. And so I've sped past these early drawing stages as fast as possible, because drawing out a character digitally in line art is just like, it's like doing my taxes. I hate it. And that doesn't mean that everyone should hate it or that it is like a bad or a boring part of the process. It's simply, a reflection of my own tastes. If you find that rendering is really getting you down, I bet you could probably go even further with using your line art in conjunction with some simple flats, and maybe rather than worry about these kinds of transitions here, like you've got these, you've done a little bit of blending here, and it looks like you're just doing, simple blending with a brush, right? You're just going in here with a brush, doing a little sample and smudging the line up a little bit. I think that's the best way to do it, I think. But one of the other ways that you can sort of create roundness for the face is if you have like a big lasso selection on an area, you can just use a big ass soft brush and create a little bit of a light gradient. Like sometimes some people will actually literally just use the gradient tool. But I think if you've got a nice line art and you're able to make some good selections, working with like a selection and a soft brush can get a lot of sense of volume very, very quickly without you having to get into a lot of little nitty gritty, transition, like painterly transitions all over the form. I personally love getting in there and pushing around every edge and controlling every little edge. But like, that's my obsession. I would be curious to see what would happen if you were to focus a little bit more on like even flatter shapes, less subdivision, and like a little bit more of a gradient. A mix, mixing gradients in with your flats, I think would be really interesting. What do you think?
Okay, I'll keep that in mind for the next homework.
This is a step that I kind of worked into my process, was to actually use a little bit of soft brush earlier on to get a sense of volume on figures. And it's like, I don't even necessarily think that you need to be accurate about it, but there's something about having like the larger volume of the figure kind of blocked in by a very loose, wide gradient that I think is really appealing. I don't know, might be an option.
Yes, thank you so much for the advice.
All right, we are right at the end of this thing, so I'm going to give the homework for next week. I forgot to pull reference so you guys can watch me do it live. We have a folder, we have a channel, and I'm thinking about renaming it. It's called Today is the Day. That was because I was doing daily studies, and I was encouraging everybody else to do daily studies too. And so Today is the Day is a reference to the idea that it is, any day can be the day that you decide to start making a daily study habit. Oh, this is a really good one. Like this piece for the assignment that I'm going to be giving here. What I want you to do is I want you to do a study of this piece, but I want you to do what some people were actually already doing this last week. This is the reference for this week. And I want you guys to be doing what some of the people this week already did, which is to take the reference and then I want you to apply a new color palette to it. So that means no orange flowers. That means no blue jean jacket. It's not even necessarily the same skin tone. An example of this from my past studies, you can do whatever you want with the color. The skin tone can be colored or gray, you can use a variety of different, you can make some of these elements black and white, some of them in color. You can, like I did with this, you can completely invert all the colors that are in it. I wish I had the specific references to compare to here. Oh boy, these images are all so familiar. I spent 2 hours staring at every single one of them. I was doing one of these every single day for a bit. Here we go. So this is a good comparison. So the point of it is to keep the structure of it generally the same, and the relationship of values, relationship of colors generally the same. But I want you to create a different hue for everything. Find a way of discovering a unique, special color palette out of your imagination and apply it over the reference in a way that like gives it new life. This might sound like a little bit of an advanced exercise, but I don't think it's too early to start messing around with color. I think that even if you're just a beginner, what I want you to understand as soon as possible is that like color is this beautiful, flexible friend. It's this friend that always says yes when you invite it places. You know, like you say, let's go to purple, and the color says, yes, let's go. Like I want you to ask it to go someplace surprising and unexpected and see where it goes with you. It should feel a little bit odd, a little bit exciting. I want you to feel like you're not entirely in control of the work and just like have fun with the results that you get. There's no wrong answers as far as the color is concerned. There's all these like, you know, what do you call them? Guides on complementary colors and split complements and triads and things. Forget it. Color theory is a different class. You can get into the super technical stuff later. What I want you to do is get yourself into a little bit of color trouble. If I had to name this assignment for this week, it would be that. Thanks everyone for joining me this week. I'll see you back here on Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. Sound good? Oh, does it have to be a painting or can it be line art with color? It can be line art with color. Absolutely. All right. Thanks everyone.